911 call audio begins. Slight static. Dispatcher, 911, what's your emergency? Caller, I don't know how to explain this. A man went into my building. He never came out. The line goes quiet. Narrator, at 11:59 p.m., a man enters the apartment building where he lives. The security camera captures everything clearly. His face, his posture. The moment the glass door closes behind him, the timestamp reads 23:59. 2 minutes later, at 12:01 a.m., he no longer exists in the timeline of that building. No footage shows him leaving. No alarms were triggered. No emergency exits were opened. According to the cameras, the man simply stops. This isn't a case of missing footage. There are only 2 cameras inside the building, and investigators believe they covered every possible exit. The front door, the elevator hallway, the stairwell access. If someone entered, they would be seen. If someone left, they would be seen. But this man does neither. When detectives first reviewed the footage, they assumed the explanation would be obvious. People don't vanish into thin air. Buildings don't erase human beings. So the initial theory was simple: he must still be inside. Search teams combed the property from top to bottom. They checked storage rooms, maintenance areas, even the elevator shaft. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence, just silence. And that silence was disturbing, because as investigators replayed the footage again and again, one question became impossible to ignore. If the cameras didn't miss him leaving, then what did they miss instead? This case wouldn't be solved by finding new evidence. It would be solved by realizing that something everyone trusted, the timeline itself, was wrong. And once that realization set in, this wasn't a missing person case anymore. It was something much darker. Fade out. Who he was before 23:59. Narrator. Before investigators could understand how this man disappeared, they had to understand who he was. His name was Evan Miller, 34 years old, office job, no criminal record. On paper, Evan lived an unremarkable life, the kind that rarely ends up in police reports. He worked regular hours, paid his rent on time, and kept mostly to himself. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, forgettable. And that word forgettable would later matter more than anyone realized. Evan had lived in the building for just under a year. No known disputes with neighbors. No recent complaints filed by management. But when detectives began pulling his phone records under an affidavit, a different picture started to emerge. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Evan's behavior subtly changed. His call history showed late-night conversations, short, frequent, and always deleted afterward. Text messages were sparse, almost clinical. No jokes, no emojis, just logistics. Friends told police Evan had become increasingly withdrawn. He canceled plans, stopped answering calls. When asked if Evan seemed afraid, one coworker paused before answering. Not afraid, more like distracted, like he was thinking 3 steps ahead. The night he disappeared, Evan left work at his usual time. Security cameras downtown showed him stopping at a convenience store, buying a bottle of water and nothing else. No alcohol, no impulsive purchases. His movements were deliberate. When he approached his apartment building at 11:58 p.m., his phone battery was at 62%. The last outgoing message was sent less than a minute before he entered the lobby. It read, "I'm here." Investigators couldn't tell who the message was for, but they knew one thing: Evan wasn't running from something. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't careless. Whatever waited for him inside that building at 23:59, he expected it. Fade out. A place designed to be seen. Narrator. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about the building itself. A 6-story apartment complex, built in the early 2000s. Concrete stairwells, a single elevator, and one main entrance facing the street. The kind of place designed for efficiency, not secrecy. Security inside the building was minimal but intentional. There were 2 cameras. The first was mounted above the front entrance, angled downward to capture every person who walked in or out. Faces were clear. Movements were clean. No blind spot at the door. The second camera faced the interior hallway, covering access to the elevator and the stairwell. Together, they were believed to form a closed system. If someone entered the building, camera A would see it. If someone moved deeper inside or left, camera B would capture that movement. At least that was the theory. Detectives mapped the layout repeatedly. No secondary exits. No fire escape accessible from the lobby. Emergency doors were alarmed and showed no activity that night. The elevator logs showed no faults. The stairwell had no obstructions. From an investigative standpoint, the building was a controlled environment, which made Evan's disappearance even more troubling. When police first reviewed the footage, they weren't looking for something complex. They were looking for the obvious. Someone leaving right after Evan. Someone following him inside. Anything out of place. They found nothing. Between 11:59 p.m. and 12:10 a.m., no one else entered or exited the building. No residents, no visitors, no delivery drivers, just Evan. That's when the case took its first unsettling turn. Because if the building worked the way it was supposed to, then Evan didn't disappear. He was removed. And whatever happened next didn't rely on chance, panic, or improvisation. It relied on knowing the building better than the cameras did. Fade out. A timeline that shouldn't exist. Narrator. Investigators would later describe the next 2 minutes as the most analyzed footage of the entire case. From 11:59 p.m. to 12:01 a.m., every frame was reviewed, paused, rewound, examined again. This was the window where Evan Miller vanished. At 23:59 and 2 seconds, camera A captures Evan stepping through the front door. His shoulders are relaxed. His hands are visible. There's no sign of urgency. He pauses briefly, less than a second, as the door closes behind him. This detail matters. People who expect danger move differently. They rush. They hesitate. Evan does neither. At 23:59 and 18 seconds, Evan moves out of camera A's frame and into the interior hallway. Camera B picks him up almost immediately. The transition is clean. No missing frames. No lag. No interference. He walks past the elevator doors without pressing the call button. Instead, he turns slightly toward the stairwell. This is where investigators initially thought they'd find the answer. But the stairwell camera shows nothing. No door opening, no shadow movement, no sound trigger. Evan simply never appears again. At 12:01 a.m., the timeline breaks. Camera B continues recording the empty hallway. The elevator remains idle. The stairwell door never opens. And yet, Evan does not reappear on camera A. He doesn't leave. He doesn't run. He doesn't come back. Detectives replayed the footage at full speed, then half speed, then frame by frame. They weren't asking what happened. They were asking something more unsettling. How can someone obey every rule of physics and still disappear? Because if the footage was accurate, then Evan didn't vanish between cameras. He vanished between seconds. Fade out. In the first 24 hours, Evan Miller's case was treated as a routine missing person investigation. No blood. No witnesses, no immediate evidence of foul play. From the outside, it looked like an adult man who had simply chosen to disappear. But inside the department, detectives weren't convinced. The building was locked down and treated as a controlled scene. 9 units were brought in to track Evan's scent. The dogs followed it from the front door straight into the lobby. And then the trail stopped, not faded, not confused, stopped. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. No one reported hearing an argument. No raised voices. No sounds of a struggle. Inside the building, every tenant was interviewed. Most stories were short, uneventful, forgettable, until one detail kept repeating. Everyone remembered seeing Evan enter. No one remembered seeing him later. Phone records were pulled under an affidavit. Evan's phone last pinged the nearest cell tower at 11:59 p.m. inside the building. After that, there was nothing. No calls, no texts, no movement. His bank accounts showed no activity. His credit cards were untouched. This wasn't a man starting a new life. This was a man whose life had been interrupted. By the third day, the lead detective made a quiet but critical decision. The case status changed. Evan Miller was no longer just missing. He was officially considered a person of interest in his own disappearance, a procedural step that allowed investigators to dig deeper, faster, and more aggressively. But with no body, no weapon, and no crime scene, the investigation was running out of time, which is often when the most dangerous mistakes are made. Fade out. With no physical evidence, investigators turned to the one place where cracks often form first: people. Every resident who had been inside the building that night was brought in for questioning. Most interviews followed the same pattern: short answers, neutral tone, little emotional involvement. That by itself wasn't unusual until detectives reached Daniel Brooks. Daniel lived on the third floor, mid-30s, worked night shifts. No prior contact with Evan, at least officially. From the moment the interview began, something felt off. Daniel spoke calmly, too calmly. His posture was relaxed, shoulders back, hands folded neatly on the table. No visible signs of stress. When asked if he had seen Evan that night, Daniel answered quickly, "No, I came home earlier, didn't see anyone." But the speed of the response mattered. People recalling real memories often pause. They search. They hesitate. Daniel didn't. As detectives tightened the timeline, Daniel's language shifted. He began over-explaining, adding unnecessary details, clarifying points no one had questioned. This behavior is common when someone isn't recalling events but constructing them. Then came the slip. When shown a still frame from camera A, Daniel leaned forward. "That's him, right, around midnight." Detectives hadn't mentioned the time. Daniel had. His tone changed after that, still calm but controlled, as if he realized he'd stepped too close to something dangerous. When read his Miranda rights, Daniel didn't ask for a lawyer. He smiled and said, "I've got nothing to hide." For seasoned investigators, that phrase rarely means what it sounds like, because innocent people want protection, guilty people want control, and Daniel Brooks wanted very badly to stay in control of the timeline. Fade out. For weeks, the investigation was trapped inside the same assumption, that the cameras were telling the truth, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but technically. It wasn't until a digital forensics analyst reviewed the raw files, not the footage but the metadata, that something finally broke. The timestamps didn't match, not by much, not enough to notice at first glance, but enough to matter. Camera A, the one at the front entrance, was running 1 minute and 12 seconds behind. Camera B, the hallway camera, was synced to a different internal clock. Both cameras worked, both recorded continuously, but they were not recording the same time. This single flaw changed everything, because it meant Evan didn't move seamlessly from one camera to the next. There was an overlap, a blind moment investigators had unknowingly created by trusting the timestamps instead of the data. When the footage was realigned manually, a new sequence emerged. At what camera be labeled 12 and 14 seconds, a shadow crosses the hallway floor. Not Evan, someone else, just outside the frame. That shadow had been there the entire time, hidden in plain sight. Suddenly, Daniel Brooks' comment during his interview made sense. Around midnight, right, he hadn't guessed, he remembered. With the corrected timeline, detectives realized Evan wasn't alone inside the building, and he hadn't vanished between seconds. He had been intercepted. The case was immediately reclassified. This was no longer a disappearance. It was now being investigated as a premeditated act, and for the first time, investigators weren't asking where did Evan go, they were asking, who made sure he never left? Fade out. Once the timeline was corrected, one name moved from the margins to the center of the investigation: Daniel Brooks. He wasn't the loudest voice. He wasn't the most emotional. He was the most prepared. Daniel had lived in the building for over 6 years, long enough to understand its rhythms, long enough to know when the elevator stalled, long enough to notice which cameras were maintained and which ones weren't. Opportunity wasn't something he stumbled into. It was something he waited for. Detectives revisited Daniel's interview with fresh eyes, the calm demeanor, the rehearsed phrasing. the absence of fear. These weren't signs of innocence. They were signs of control. When confronted with the corrected timeline, Daniel didn't react immediately. No spike in emotion, no visible panic. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. A delay. In interrogation psychology, delays matter. They signal recalculation. When asked directly if he had encountered Evan that night, Daniel changed his language. Before he said, "I didn't see anyone." Now he said, "I don't remember seeing him." That shift was subtle but critical. Memory gaps appear when facts become dangerous. Motive emerged slowly. Evan and Daniel weren't strangers. Phone records showed a series of short calls between them in the weeks before the disappearance. Not frequent enough to suggest friendship, too consistent to be accidental. When detectives asked Daniel about the calls, he smiled. "People talk. It doesn't mean anything, but context does." And in this case, context suggested planning. By the end of the second interview, detectives weren't chasing a theory anymore. They were watching a man try and slowly fail to stay ahead of a timeline that was no longer under his control. Once Daniel Brooks was officially named the primary suspect, the case moved from the detective's office to the district attorney's desk. The DA's team faced a significant challenge. There was no body, no weapon, only surveillance footage, witness statements, and behavioral evidence. Court proceedings began months later. The prosecution built its case carefully, step by step. They presented the corrected camera timelines, emphasizing the 2-minute window where Evan had vanished. They highlighted Daniel's prior knowledge of the building, his patterned calls to Evan, and his behavior under interrogation. Expert witnesses dissected body language and microexpressions, explaining how calm demeanor and over-explanations often indicate deception. For the jury, these subtleties painted a portrait of someone capable of premeditated action, someone who could manipulate the environment to their advantage. The defense argued there was no direct physical evidence. They emphasized that assumptions about behavior and control were circumstantial. They stressed that the cameras could still have technical glitches, that memory gaps do not equal guilt. But the prosecution's narrative was compelling. The man who knew the building, the man with repeated contacts to Evan, and the man who controlled his emotions perfectly in interviews. He had opportunity, motive, and knowledge to make Evan disappear. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. Hours passed, minutes stretched. Every detail from the timeline, every witness statement, every behavioral analysis scrutinized. And then the verdict. Guilty on charges of premeditated murder. Sentencing followed. Daniel Brooks received life imprisonment without parole. The DA described the case as one of the most unusual disappearances we've ever prosecuted, noting that it had been solved without a body, relying heavily on behavioral analysis and timeline reconstruction. For the detectives, it was a relief. For Evan's family, even after the verdict, the building never felt the same. Residents reported quiet footsteps in the hallways late at night. Doors that had been securely locked sometimes seemed slightly ajar. A shadow here, a movement there, nothing concrete, but enough to unsettle anyone who had witnessed Evan's last night alive. Evan's family tried to move on. His mother still kept his apartment key on a hook by the door, unused. His younger sister often stared at the security footage, frozen frame by frozen frame, searching for something she could never fully understand. The detectives, too, carried the case with them. They had solved it in the court of law, but some questions lingered in the shadows. Could they have missed something? Was there ever a way Evan could have escaped the building alive? Or had the meticulously controlled timeline left him no choice but to vanish into someone else's plan? The cameras, which once seemed infallible, became symbols. They never lie, investigators said at first. They just record what's in front of them. But the truth was more unsettling. Cameras don't lie, people do. Even now, months later, investigators occasionally replay the footage. Every frame, every second, every shadow searching for a clue, a micro-expression, a pause that could reveal something they had missed. Because in cases like this, it's not the law that leaves the mark. It's the silence, the absence. The moment when time itself seems to bend and a man walks into a building at 23:59 and never comes out.